1800s, a bottle of whiskey might contain prune juice, tobacco spit, or even industrial alcohol. And the worst part? Nobody actually knew what was in their whiskey. This is why the American government created the Bottled and Bond Act 1897. So what exactly is bottled and bond? Well, there's a little bit more to it than just a federal guarantee of quality. We have the rectifiers versus distillers argument, we have the Taft decision, the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, and of course Josephine Roche. But we'll start with the rectifiers. So, how exactly were the rectifiers? Essentially, rectifiers were middlemen who could transform cheap neutral spirits by adding colourings like tea, prune juice or tobacco spit, flavourings like caramel or fruit essences, and other additives to mimic the appearance and taste of aged whiskey. In the 1800s, rectification became such a problem that distillers started to fight back. Why were rectifiers such a problem? And how did the government respond? On the 3rd of March 1897, President Grover Cleveland signed the Bottled and Bond Act into law. One of his biggest supporters was Colonel H. Taylor Jr., who summed it up quite perfectly with, "The government stamp on your bottle is your guarantee that what's inside is exactly what it claims to be." Now, the Bottled and Bond law, this gave consumers of whiskey a government guarantee of quality. It was the first consumer protection law for whiskey, and it meant that whiskey was protected, aged in bonded warehouses and sealed with a government tax stamp. What does Bottled and Bond require? Those rules are 1 distiller, 1 distillery, 1 distilling season, whiskey must be bottled at 100 proof, and stored in bonded warehouses for a minimum of 4 years. Did Bottled and Bond resolve the whiskey problem? Even though Bottled and Bond had been passed in law, there was still no answer to the question, what was whiskey? The rectifiers were still selling their fake whiskey. Labels on bottles offered no clarification as to what was inside the bottle. And consumers, rightly so, were, simply confused. And as a whole, the whiskey industry continued to argue. What changed with the Pure Food and Drug Act? In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act into law. His chief chemist, Harvey Wiley, ruled only spirit aged in oak and cooked with water could be called pure whiskey. Everything else had to be labelled differently. Now, this infuriated rectifiers who could no longer pass off their doctored blends as straight whiskey, and it also infuriated importers of Scotch, Irish and Canadian whiskies, which, under Wiley's definition, could now only be sold as imitation whiskey. The Pure Food and Drug Act had placed an emphasis on truth and labelling, but not truth and identity. It didn't define whiskey, and it didn't settle the fight. So what exactly is whiskey? Even with the Pure Food and Drug Act now signed into law in 1906, nothing had changed within the whiskey industry. Then, in 1909, things came to a head. President William Howard Taft stepped in and made the first clear definitions of what was a straight whiskey and what was a blended whiskey. The dispute became so heated that samples of whiskey from both sides were gathered as evidence. When the issue reached the White House, President William Howard Taft personally reviewed the case. He even sampled some of the whiskies involved. Taft had inherited years of infighting between distillers, rectifiers and importers, and after reviewing the issue, he announced his decision on the 26th of December 1909. And while he sided with the rectifiers on the broad definition of whiskey, he also demanded honest labelling so consumers knew what they were buying. This is what he decided and what changed. Whiskey, any spirit made from grain, could be called whiskey, even neutral spirit. Molasses spirit, those were excluded. Those had to be sold as rum. Straight whiskey, whiskey made in the traditional way, aged in barrels, could be labelled as straight. Blended whiskey, these were mixes of whiskey and neutral spirits and had to be labelled as blends. Imitation whiskey, these were products made entirely from rectified or neutral spirits and had to say so on the label. Taft's decision had allowed consumers to distinguish between straight whisky, blends and rectified spirits. Distillers had been calling for clarity like this for decades. Men like Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. and James E. Pepper had long argued that whisky made the traditional way deserved to be protected from imitation spirits. However, compliance was inconsistent. Some distillers followed the ruling, while others chose to ignore it, creating confusion in the marketplace. Though Taft had settled the federal government's position on whisky labelling under the Pure Food and Drug Act, many assumed the battle was over. They were wrong. Another storm was brewing. What storm was causing concern for the whisky industry? The temperance movement had been around since the late 1800s, but with the proliferation of whisky, they argued alcohol was the root of poverty, domestic abuse, and moral decay. The movement was gaining momentum, and in 1917, when the USA entered World War I, the Lever Act was brought into law. This halted the production of all distilled spirits. This was the first step towards prohibition. What happened to bourbon during prohibition? In 1919, the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified. This was the start of prohibition, and in 1920 the Volstead Act enforced the amendment. This banned the production, sale and transportation of alcohol across the United States. Many distilleries were forced to close, and only 6 major distilleries were allowed to remain open to make medicinal whiskey. Those were Brown-Forman, Glenmore Distilleries, Frankfort Distilleries, Schenley, American Medicinal Spirits and APH Stitzel. With the large quantities of whiskey now held in bonded warehouses, these fell under the control of the government. And with the absence of whiskey production, bootlegging became very popular, with the likes of George Remus being a prominent figure. The bourbon industry had collapsed. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the whiskey industry had to rebuild, and the government needed a new system to regulate alcohol. It needed structure, oversight, and a clear definition of what whiskey had become. Enter Josephine Roche. Who is Josephine Roche, and where does she fit in? Josephine Roche was appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 to the position of Assistant Secretary to the Treasury. This was seen by many as a controversial post, but in almost the 3 years of her tenure, she oversaw the Public Health Service, championed labour rights and welfare reform, but most importantly for whiskey, she helped shape the newly formed Federal Alcohol Administration, and it was under her leadership that Taft's guidance on whiskey was transformed into binding law. In 1936, Roche signed off on the legal definition of straight whiskey: spirit distilled from grain, aged at least 2 years and bottled without additives other than water. 5 years after the repeal in 1938, the finishing touch was added, in part thanks to the regulatory groundwork laid by Josephine Roche and the newly formed Federal Alcohol Administration. Under their guidance, bourbon and straight rye were now required to be aged in new charred oak barrels. So after all that, what does bottled and bond actually mean today? From the proliferation of rectified doctored whiskey through to the repeal of Prohibition, the Bottled and Bond Act remains a legal standard. It is defined in US federal law controlled by the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, but must follow the rules laid out in 1897. 1 distilling season, 1 distiller, 1 distillery, aged at least 4 years in a bonded warehouse and bottled at no more than 100 proof. The next time you see Bottled and Bond on a label, you're not just looking at whiskey, you're looking at a promise that's been protected by law since 1897. And that's just another piece of bourbon history. Can't folks.